It's the Religious Studies Project. I'm David.
And I'm Chris.
And we are here again with a podcast for you this week. Chris is the interviewer as well as the host.
Oh no.
That's why you're hearing me talk. The interviewee is Ilkka Lindstedt, and the subject is Critical Approaches to Pre-Islamic Arabia. Very interesting. Let's have it.
Given the way in which many introductory courses present the history of early Islam and pre-Islamic Arabia, we may be tempted to think that the historical facts were well established and the narrative uncontested. However, this is far from the case. What evidence do we actually have from this period, and how may it challenge the conventional narratives that have become canonized in both sacred and academic histories? What misconceptions might be challenged by modern epigraphic work, or the application of social identity theories to ancient texts? And why might this matter for contemporary Islam, contemporary Islamic studies, or for the study of religion more broadly? Joining me today in Helsinki is Ilkka Lindstedt, who holds a PhD and title of docent in Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Helsinki, where he's currently university lecturer in Islamic theology at the Faculty of Theology. He's published studies on early Islam, Arabic historiography, and Arabic epigraphy, and recent edited volumes in English include the co-edited Case Studies in Transmission and the forthcoming Translation and Transmission in the First Millennium, which are both with Ugarit Verlag. And you can see his institutional website or academia.edu page for more information, and we'll link to that on the website. So first off, Dr. Ilkka Lindstedt, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you very much.
So, broadly, we're talking about pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islam today, which will obviously be something that's quite familiar to you, but to the broader religious studies community might not be. So if we could start off just broadly telling me about your area of research, what kind of sources are you using? How do you go about doing such research and things like that? And what are you interested in and why?
Thank you. So I'm interested in late antique Arabia, pre-Islamic Arabia from the 3rd century Common Era onward up till the early Islamic period, let's say the 8th century Common Era. So the Prophet Muhammad lived in the 6th and 7th century, died in 632. So that gives a sort of a framework where we are operating. And I'm especially interested in approaching early Islam with social identity theories formulated in social psychology, and how those can be used to study early Islam and pre-Islamic Arabia as well. And I try to use as much as possible that we have at hand dated materials, contemporary materials, especially epigraphy is an important source set that we have from pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islamic era as well.
Excellent. You might want to... I actually had to look up what epigraphic sources meant before we spoke about this, so you might, if you clarify for our listeners what they are. And also, more of our listeners are probably familiar with perhaps biblical studies, because, it tends to sit in study of religion departments in some way. I certainly did some biblical studies back in the day, so it'd be interesting to hear how similar or different you might find, might describe your work to the work that might be done by a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, for example.
Yeah. So by epigraphic sources, I mean inscriptions, and in this particular case, especially lapidary inscriptions, so inscriptions engraved in stone, and those have been, preserved in tens of thousands from pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia. And and I would say that my study, and I definitely use as much as possible approaches and methods developed in biblical studies, especially, the understanding of that we should use contemporary sources as much as possible. Most people dealing with early Islam have been using Islamic era, much later sources to study the life of the Prophet or pre-Islamic Arabia, for instance. So, and also social identity approach is something that has been used in biblical studies since the 1990s, especially to study the New Testament, but also the Hebrew Bible, and see how people in those texts and how those texts categorize the world. And also one question that has been studied quite a lot in biblical studies is the question of the parting of the ways. When do Judaism and Christianity become different categories? When did people start to see them as Christians as opposed to Jews? And that question is something that hasn't been asked too much in Islamic studies. So up until 1990s, very few people asked the question, when did Muslims actually start to categorize them as Muslims, self-identify as Muslims? So that's kind of new question.
Excellent, and we'll get to that towards the end of the interview. So before we start diving into the misconceptions that might be challenged by some of your work and others into pre-Islamic Arabia, we should get some of those misconceptions out there onto the table. Again, our listeners may not just know the sort of basic narrative, but what are some of the times, places, and traditional narratives that we're talking about here relating to early Islam and pre-Islamic Arabia? I know that I certainly have always thought of, the Arabian Peninsula was full of the nomads who all thought of themselves as Arabs, and Mecca was a really central key trading post, and they all came there, and there were lots of deities in the Kaaba and things like that. That's the narrative that I had, but I think that's not quite right. So maybe let's tell us a bit about the context, and then how we can challenge that with some of these sources that you look at.
Right. So I guess the received tradition, we have to start with we could start with the birth of the Prophet Muhammad around the year 570 in Mecca. And like you said, in the Islamic era narratives, Mecca is portrayed as being a place where almost everybody was polytheist. So according to these Arabic narratives, there might have been a couple of Christians or Jews living in Mecca, but there were only a few of them, and they were a few and far between. So 99% of the people, according to these sources, seem to be polytheists. So that's 570 or so. And then in 610, the Prophet starts to receive his first revelations, conveyed by the Archangel Gabriel, but coming ultimately from God. And at that time, the Meccan polytheist aristocracy is not happy with the monotheist message that the Prophet Muhammad is trying to convey in Mecca. So Muhammad receives very few converts, very few followers. One of them is actually his wife, Khadija, who becomes one of the first, or maybe the first convert to Islam. But still, he has very, very few followers in those years, in 610s, and the polytheist aristocracy, as it's usually called in Western scholarship, tries to come after the Prophet and his followers, and they even torture some of his followers. And this situation leads to emigration to Mecca. This is called the Hijrah, the emigration to Mecca, which happens in 622, and this becomes later the first year of the Islamic era and Islamic calendar. And in Medina, the situation becomes better for the Prophet, so he rises quite quickly to the top of this city-state, as we might call it, of Medina, and he becomes both the religious and the political leader of Medina. And so early Muslims of Medina and the polytheists of Mecca are at war during those years, and around the year 630, early Muslims are victorious and conquer Mecca. But still, the Prophet stays in Medina and actually dies there in 632. So that's sort of the traditional narrative that we have here.
So, before we challenge that narrative through some of the, written sources, what kind of sources do we have from around that period? I know that there's sort of more literary sources, there's these inscriptions, so maybe just tell us what kind of sources exactly, and then maybe provide some challenges to that narrative.
So up until very recently, scholars were using Islamic era Arabic literary sources that we have quite a lot of them. So thousands and thousands of pages of historiographical sources of different sort of literary genres written in Arabic. But that Arabic literature is actually quite late. So usually it's said that it's born in the 8th century and starts to develop from that century onward. So it's at least 100 years later than the Prophet. So, but still, most of the scholars have been using that source set to engage with pre-Islamic Arabia as well, and the life of the Prophet. But recently, people have been turning their sight towards contemporary sources that we might have, and these are especially these inscriptions that I was mentioning. So from pre-Islamic Arabia, from the south and from the north, we have vast quantity of epigraphic material, actually. So from the south, from Yemen, we have something like 10,000 pre-Islamic South Arabian inscriptions, and from the north we have even more, so something like 50,000 or more are published now, and all the time people doing fieldwork are finding more and more of these inscriptions. So, and many of them are yet to be published, even though they have already been recorded. So it's a vast quantity of material and written in different languages. So not all of it is in Arabic. Actually, a very little of it, or only a subset of this material is in Arabic. So that's something that we have from pre-Islamic era. Then from Islamic era, of course, we also have Arabic inscriptions. Not so many of them, but let's say that from the first 100 years of Hijrah, so the Islamic era, we have something like 100 dated inscriptions, and probably much more that are undated, but we can maybe paleographically date to that era as well. So we have quite a few of inscriptions that are actually produced in Arabia, preserved in Arabia, and produced also oftentimes by people who are not part of the elite. So that's important to notice. So much of this material is actually graffiti. So stuff that the people were just writing or engraving in stone when they were en route to somewhere and they were camping somewhere. So they spent an hour or so to carve their name and a message, simpler or longer, on stone. And so that's very important set of sources that has not been utilized very much.
And so what have these sorts of sources done perhaps to that traditional narrative that you laid out beforehand? Maybe a couple of key examples of things that might challenge that.
Yeah, especially the polytheist milieu of Arabia in the pre-Islamic era is something that has been challenged by these inscriptions. So, for instance, in Yemen, we see quite clearly that up to the 4th century Common Era, all of this epigraphic material is polytheist. So there are mention of many gods, Al-Maqah, for instance, who is a god associated with moon, or Shamash associated with sun. So sort of this traditional polytheist milieu. But then in the 4th century, something happens quite drastically, and we see in the epigraphic record that only monotheism is present in these texts, and this continues up to the 6th century when the Prophet was born. And in particular, it seems that the form of monotheism is Judaism that was adopted at least by the elite in Yemen, but probably also by the lay people to an extent at least. And so we don't have, from the 4th century up to the 6th century, we don't have any polytheist evidence from Yemen at all. So all the inscriptions that we have are either Jewish or Christian in nature. So they signal some sort of monotheist and also Jewish or Christian identity. And then also in the north, we see that Christianity, in particular, is spreading and advancing from the 3rd century onward. And we have we don't have so much material as from the south, when it comes to late antiquity, so say the 3rd century onward. But everything that we have seems to point towards the idea that Christianity was spreading and spreading fast. So actually, when we look at what we have from the 6th century, which is the century when the Prophet was born, we don't have a single text produced and preserved in Arabia that would be polytheist. So everything that we have is monotheist, either Christian or Jewish, or then something that we cannot actually pinpoint what it actually is, or then it maybe didn't even matter to the people who were engraving those inscriptions. But this is the case. Of course, the Hijaz, or the Western Arabia, where the Prophet lived, according to the traditional narrative and also according to the majority of scholars. So from the Hijaz, we don't actually have so much material at all from the 6th century. So that's, of course, sort of still like a question mark, what's going on in the Hijaz in the 6th century. But in any case, it seems that in parts of, and in most parts of Arabia, Christianity and Judaism were spreading fast.
Absolutely. Maybe one more example here before we get on to your social identity work. I mean, perhaps, so I was quite surprised to hear that Mecca maybe wasn't quite the big deal that we've been led to believe.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. In this Islamic era, sources, which, like I said, are late, they seem to describe Mecca as a place which was pilgrimage center, which was a trade center along the trade routes, maybe that crisscrossed Arabia. But when we actually look at pre-Islamic evidence, for instance, Greek literature, Greek geographical literature, and also these inscriptions that we have from Arabia, none of them actually mention Mecca. None. And they do mention quite a few Arabian cities and towns. So, for instance, they mention Medina, Yathrib, which was the old name of Medina, quite a lot of times. So it seems that Medina was an important, or was along these trade routes that started from Yemen and went to Syria and the Mediterranean. But Mecca maybe wasn't such a big deal. So it might have been a local center, but it's not mentioned at all in the extant evidence that we have from pre-Islamic era. So that makes me think, at least, that Mecca wasn't that important in the pre-Islamic era.
But obviously there might be various reasons that it's obviously very important now and became very important. So there may be an element of sort of reading that into the past. So we've only got about 10 minutes left. This always happens. So some of your other work then is taken sort of quite a modern social identity approach, and specifically what I've read anyway was looking at in the Qur'an, looking at the sort of different group dynamics in there. Perhaps you could just quickly introduce what a social identity approach might be, and then how you have used that to analyze the different groups in the Qur'an.
Yeah. So the social identity approach was developed in social psychology since the 1970s by Henry Tatchell and his students, and later many more scholars. And the approach tries to look at social identity especially. So not so much self-identity, but social identity. So sort of the sum of group affiliations and identities that we have and possess and signal. So, and it makes a set of predicaments based on experiments and ethnographic research, what group affiliation does and categorization does in the group dynamics. So people have quite clearly noticed that this categorization into in-group that we affiliate with and into the out-group, which is the others, this sort of categorization is very natural in us, and it usually and oftentimes leads to the fact that people are more helpful to the in-group members. They attach more positive adjectives to the in-group members, and they allow that there are different people in the in-group, so sort of heterogeneous view of the in-group, whereas the out-group is usually seen as a sort of like a block, a monolith, homogeneous group of people, and sometimes it is, and oftentimes it is, stereotyped in a way. So negative adjective and attributes are attached to the out group.
Yeah, and you might have sort of positive attribution bias towards an in-group, where some behavior exhibited by a member of your in-group will be interpreted positively, and if the same behavior is in the out-group, it might have a different interpretation, but based on the same thing.
Right.
That kind of dynamics. Yeah. Okay. So how does one study that in the Qur'an? I mean, you said there it's maybe initially developed as a more sort of contemporary ethnographic thing. So how might one study that in this ancient text? And then what have you found regarding to different religion-related groups?
Yeah. So I think the social identity approach gives a lot of insights to ancient and pre-modern texts as well. So instead of actually asking, because oftentimes people have approached the Quran, and especially the polemic verses in the Quran, as signaling that there was some sort of clash between the groups, whereas people that have been using the social identity approach in biblical studies have noticed that oftentimes these polemical verses or polemical passages in different texts, they actually have to do with creation of the in-group identity and creation of this distinct identity. So it doesn't always have to be the case that there has been some sort of class in the past, but it actually might have something to do with the present, that the text is trying to signal a distinction toward the outgroup and trying to make this difference, whereas the sort of the facts on the ground were much more varied and much more gray area in how people were viewing themselves and the others. And also, like I said, up till 1990s, people didn't really ask in Islamic studies the question, when did Muslims start to view themselves as Muslims, as distinct to something else, as distinct to Jews, Christians, and so on. But in 1990s, Professor Fred Donner at the University of Chicago posed this question. But it hasn't been studied still in depth. There hasn't been too much people actually trying to approach with that question. But I think it is a very important question. And I think we should start with no preconceptions and start with contemporary sources, start with the Quran, and then try to understand the Quran in the context of what we know of pre-Islamic Arabia, and then see in the dated materials such as papyri and the inscriptions how that identity evolves later. So when we actually look at the Quran, we see that the in-group appellation that is used there for the in-group is believers, mu'minun. It's not yet Muslims, muslimun. So that is something that seems to happen later. And not only that, but also there are a number of verses that seem to categorize Jews and Christians as part of the in-group, part of the believers. So that makes me think that the situation is not one where Islamic identity was born already at the time of the Prophet. It wasn't ready at the time, but it evolved later. And when we actually look at the inscriptions that we have that are later than the Quran, later than the Prophet Muhammad, there we can see that it takes around 100 years before people start to call themselves Muslims or call their religion Islam. So it's only 740s when we see this sort of categorization happening, and also mention of distinctly Islamic rites. That happens in the early 8th century, not before.
But again, in a sort of standard intro to Islam class, we'll maybe hear about these verses, differentiating Islam from Christianity, that they say that God is three, God is not one, not three, he is one, and all those sorts of things. So there are some things in there which are sort of maybe anti-Christian, anti-Jewish. How does that play into what you've just said about believers as a group?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's definitely polemics against Trinitarianism and against shirk, which means associating anything with God. So that's the sort of absolute monotheism is the central message of the Quran, definitely. And I would say that any Jew or Christian who wasn't willing to part with those associating tendencies wouldn't be accepted as part of the in-group. So Trinitarian is definitely rejected in the Quran, but there are a number of verses which say that Christians are closest in love to the believers, and they are pious and they pray and they will get a reward in the afterlife. And then there are a number of verses that talk about the people of the book in positive manner. And the people of the book seems to include, well, the Quran doesn't really spell it out who the people of the book are, but it seems to include at least Jews and Christians and possibly others as well. And so there are a number of verses that seem to suggest that those people in the people of the book can be part of the in-group if they are willing to part some of their views which are against the Quranic message, and if they are willing to accept the Prophet Muhammad as a prophet and the Quran as a revelation. So those are definitely sort of identity signals that people and sort of core values that people have to accept. But then there are a number of others that are later Islamic developments. For instance, there is no conversion ritual mentioned in the Quran. The 5 daily prayers are not mentioned in the Quran. Prayer in general is, but the 5 daily prayers are not. So those sort of things. There are also 2 verses that explicitly say that Jews and Christians and the believers and maybe others as well who believe in God and the last day will get a heavenly reward. And those verses are then in later Islamic traditions understood as meaning Jews and Christians that lived before the Prophet. But the Quran doesn't say that, and it seems that in the Quran the situation is the present tense. So it seems that the Quran actually promises there some of the Jews and Christians heavenly reward and salvation as such.
Excellent. So obviously I could probe much further, but time is going to be our enemy here. So I would urge the listeners to check out your webpage and dive into some of this. But as a sort of final question, I mean, why does this stuff matter? I've often, in a sense, as with, say, historical Jesus studies, we can spend a lot of time working out what exactly was going on, what was happening at the time. But in a sense, does it matter at all? Because the figure has taken on a life of its own in a number of different ways. So why does this sort of close study of these sources matter, and what's its relevance maybe for, I guess, there's contemporary Islam, there's contemporary Islamic studies, the study of religion more broadly?
Yeah, that's a good question. To an extent, I think it probably doesn't matter to a lot of people, and maybe people in academia have a tendency to overemphasize the meaning of their research in the wider society. And you're right, people, those scholars who are working in history of Jesus studies, their studies are not probably so relevant to your average believer, your average Christian in say Finland or the UK or South Africa or wherever. So Jesus is something that matters. The Jesus figure that matters to them is probably different than what a scholar of history of Jesus would reconstruct. What I think has some sort of intrinsic value here is trying to look at what did the 7th century people or 6th century people who wrote their inscriptions, how did they see the world? And I think it sort of gives value to their views and tries to understand the world as they saw it. But when it comes to contemporary Islam and contemporary Islamic studies, of course, like I said, there's different verses dealing with the Jews, dealing with Christians, and others in the Quran, and those can be understood in different ways. And there are a number of people working inside the tradition as Muslims and as scholars who are approaching these same verses and maybe drawing similar or the same conclusion that I am here. So, for instance, Munim Sirri, who has wrote a fine book called Scriptural Polemics, tries to see how the Quran itself classifies different religions and Islam, and also probes how later and modern exegetes and modernist exegetes have understood these verses. And he seems to suggest that the Quran can be understood in pluralistic ways, and it can be understood as not being all the time in polemics with Jews and Christians and so on. So of course it might have contemporary relevance, but I'll leave it to the listener.
But it's a good example of that fine line that in the study of religion in general that we walk between, not denying the uniqueness and boundedness of a tradition, but at the same time pointing out that these things are historical developments and they're connected to their context, and sort of some may perceive that as an attack or as denigrating, and others may see it as like validating, and we're sort of walking that line of saying things are more complicated than the common narrative might say.
Yeah, sure.
Just a final question. I mean, what are you working on just now?
Yeah,
I would hate it if someone asked me.
Yeah, I'm actually with a colleague of mine, and we're writing a book about the Prophet Muhammad, and the narratives told about him, the interpretations of him, both in the medieval era and today. This is going to be in Finnish though, so but yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure some outputs will come out of that in English as well. And hey, you've now recorded an English language podcast. You might record a Finnish language podcast, so the same thing. So Ilkka Lindstedt, thank you so much for joining us on the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Ilkka and Chris.
You're welcome. Yeah, no, it was fun. Back in February in Helsinki. It was facilitated by our good friend Teemu Taira.
Is he a colleague of Teemu's then?
They are colleagues, yes, but the department sort of spread over different buildings, so I don't know that they ever really interact that much. There's study of religion and there's theology, and Ilkka's within the theological building, but they are part of the same department, and obviously he's doing... Well, as you'll have just heard, he's not doing theology in that sense. Much like at a UK university where you might have someone doing, say, critical biblical studies, but within a divinity school or theology.
Yes, indeed. Or critical approaches to non-religion within a divinity school, for that matter.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, that's good, though. It's we don't have enough critical approaches to the study of Islam, and if you're interested why that's the case, you might want to read Aaron Hughes' recent book on the subject, or indeed some of our previous interviews.
Keeping up the critical approaches angle, I mean, obviously every RSP output is critical, wink wink, nudge nudge, but David, so from me doing an interview to David doing an interview next week on Buddhism in the critical classroom.
Yes, a conversation with Matthew Hayes, which we did online, and then like 2 days later I flew to LA where he is anyway, and realized we probably could have done it in person. But nonetheless, interesting conversation on the flipping what might be seen as pedagogical problems into advantages and using it to our benefit.
Excellent.
So we come back next week.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that. I don't think we've really got anything more to say except, just keep coming back for the podcast. Check out the website. We've got this huge archive of material now.
We're over 300 episodes, I think, now.
And David and I have just been doing a bit of talking about, winding up the 2018-2019 season and what we're going to be doing over the summer, and maybe a bit of, we will be advertising for some new ways to get involved in the team. So keep your eyes peeled.
Yeah, more about that in a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, just, if you've ever thought of contributing to the project in one way or another, it's worth starting to think about that now. Thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.